Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a viewer ask a question, and he's basically saying, look, and I'm going to correct his numbers here because he got my numbers wrong, but he's saying, look, if you're saying that muscle growth only occurs for up to 28 to 48 hours after you train, what happens when I get DOMS? I get muscle soreness for 2+ days, sometimes longer after I train. Doesn't that mean the muscle is still growing because it's still in the recovery process? So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing. Work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about that. All right, there's a lot of confusion there. People are confusing DOMS and muscle soreness and everything, specifically with contractile protein recovery. And what you need to understand, DOMS, which is again is delayed onset muscle soreness, is not actually in the contractile proteins. It's actually within the connective tissue surrounding your muscle tissue and over on the ends of the muscle tissue. The muscle fascia, that's where DOMS occurs. That's micro-tearing of the fascia. That has nothing to do with the actual tissue proteins. In fact, there has been no association at all between DOMS, muscle soreness, and muscle growth. So actually getting yourself sore isn't even useful. It's not even been found to help with muscle growth. There's a few factors that cause you to get sore from training, and generally they're going to tend to be either training with far more workload than you're normally used to, like you increased the workload quite a bit, you did a lot more work than normal. Maybe instead of just adding a set or adding a rep or adding 5 pounds, you came in and added 3 sets. All right, normally you do 4 sets of an exercise, you did 7. Or you just dramatically increase the workload in some way will do it. If you're not training often enough, that can do it. Meaning people who have a leg day and only train their legs once a week tend to get really, really sore after leg day. If you get sore repeatedly after doing the same training, that's one of the signs that you may not actually be training that muscle often enough. Because your training is too infrequent, you're getting sore without an actual benefit. So people talk about recovery and everything, and the funny thing there is that it's actually, you tend to get sore if you go too long without training. Any given body part, any muscle, sometimes even an actual function, like one specific function of a muscle doesn't get trained, all of a sudden you get sore. And again, it's because it's novel training stimulus, because you're not chronically doing that same sort of training often enough. So a lot of people worry about training too often being an overtraining thing, but the reality is when you do a given exercise or train a given muscle group more frequently, you tend to get less sore less often. So it's actually the opposite of what a lot of people think, and that's why leg day makes people so sore. Combining that with the excessive volume usually in there, that's a double whammy. The other thing that can make you sore is large amounts of eccentric reps. Really slow eccentric, force eccentric, stuff like that. Very eccentric, or the negative part of the rep, the lowering of the weight, not the lifting. A heavy focus on that can also cause additional soreness that isn't always correlated with additional muscle growth. So what you need to understand is that soreness and recovery and growth are totally, totally different things. Now, that doesn't change anything regarding the muscle growth, because technically speaking, the muscle fascia can still be recovering from those little micro tears and not have recovered from those by the time the muscle is done growing. Meaning the tissue proteins have been disrupted, and they can go ahead and get more tissue proteins in there, again, proteins going into the muscle, making it bigger, making it thicker, restructuring those tissue proteins that have been disrupted. That all happens in 28 to 48 hours. All right, that all happens during that window. So that can totally happen and be completed before those little micro tears in the muscle fascia are completely healed and recovered. It can happen way before. It's not even a factor. They're not related. DOMS is a totally separate thing there. So that growth can occur, but yeah, the truth is you can still be sore from a workout that your actual muscle tissue, the contractile proteins, have already adapted and grown from. Now, the thing to be worried about, the thing to be concerned about with all of that is another factor entirely. There's also some data out there which has suggested that there is a recovery aspect that is important, meaning if you've trained so hard that your recovery takes a long time, it can eat into that growth window. Meaning it takes muscles time to recover from training. Everyone understands that. And this is where we get into a tricky balancing act. This is why it can be difficult to find the exact right amount of training volume for your personal work capacity, because it always takes muscles time to train. I don't care if you did 1 set or 20 sets. There is a time period in which it takes muscles to recover. The data out there, the prevalent data, is showing that until the muscles have gone through most of that recovery process, they don't fully get into the full muscle growing process. So that's where it gets tricky, because if it takes a muscle too long to recover from the amount of workload that you subjected it to, it may miss its growth window, because that growth window is coming back down within 48 hours. It's going to happen within 48 hours. But the reason that gets tricky, because a lot of people would say, well, you could just always do less workload. Yeah, you could do that, but you probably need to do more frequency at that point. But here's the thing. The workload also affects where you're at in that 28 to 48 hour window, meaning muscles grow a minimum of 28 hours. The growth can stop at 28 hours, or it can last up to 48 hours. Somewhere in there is your cutoff point. So it's kind of a balancing act of, well, and you're never going to figure this out. So hopefully people don't try to micromanage this. I'm just pointing this out, that's why it can be tricky, kind of trying to figure out how much workload you need, because you don't know how many hours it's going to take you to recover from a given workout, and you don't know how many hours of growth uptime you've stimulated. So because it can be a little bit tricky, that balancing act there is no way to always know for sure how much growth uptime you're getting as a result of it. Meaning a much lower workload workout is going to stimulate muscle growth, sure, plenty of it, as long as there's progressive overload, but your growth window might be all the way down in the 28 to 30 hour range, and but by that same token, you're going to have a much faster recovery time. It might only take those muscles a few hours to recover, so you're jumping into that growth window pretty quick. And a much higher workload workout where you did a bunch of sets, a bunch of tonnage, moved a lot of weight with those muscles, it might end up having a 24-hour recovery period where those muscles, the muscle tissue, needs 24 hours to recover, but it also stimulated 48 hours of growth uptime of muscle protein synthesis turnover. So it ends up being a fair amount of growth anyways. The problem becomes when you push it too hard, and that's understanding reasonable workloads. How much is too much? Well, too much is when you're just simply not recovering. If it's taken a muscle more than 24 hours to recover from a workout, you could be severely impacting muscle growth, because you only have that 2-day window for it to grow from. So really, that's one reason for a lot of naturals and drug-free people. There's been more studies done on that, like the Norwegian powerlifting team study and everything, to where they found that actually, a very high frequency training with lower volume produced superior results, because you weren't so worried about the loss of muscle growth uptime, meaning you did a workout. They had athletes do workouts that they recovered from very quickly, because it's only like 1 or 2 sets. All right, 1 set of squats. I mean, if you're not taking all the way to the extremes, you're not pushing out Widowmaker squats here with rest pause training. You're going to recover from 1 set of squats, even if you're a pretty strong squatter and you can squat 350 pounds for 7 or 8 reps. It's not absurdly difficult to recover from that if it's within your ability. You're not grinding out reps and having to go 100% to get there. You can probably recover from that pretty quickly. Definitely less than a day. Probably less than half a day, because it's only 1 real set. But, you're probably only going to grow for, 28, 30 hours from that. But the thing is, they're training again the next day. So it doesn't matter that they don't have to deal with a lot of growth time, because they're hitting the muscle again within the end of the growth window, near the end of it. So it doesn't really matter. That's why that has been found to work very well, because of that. Because it doesn't matter that they've cut down the growth uptime, because they're just training again so frequently. And it doesn't really impact their recovery to train that frequently, because the actual trauma inflicted upon the body in that single work set, that low volume, moderate intensity training that they're doing, isn't enough to severely impact recovery. That's why that model has worked so well for those athletes, as long as you watch for signs of overreaching and deloading stuff accordingly. And that's probably a better model for the drug-free lifter even trying to gain size. Even though that study was mostly on strength, they did find the size gains were really good. But, by that same token, full body 3 days a week works just as well, as long as you're keeping, Well, they would argue that they got like a 1% better from doing it that way. Arguable, but 3 times a week full body can work just as well, as long as you're keeping the tonnages, the total tonnages that you're moving within your recovery ability, so that it's not taking you more than about 24 hours to recover from it. You're still getting a lot of growth uptime. It gets really, really tricky though when people start doing very, very high volume workouts, because ultimately they are really hammering recovery ability a lot, to the point to where it could start cutting into their growth window. And then they've also got the fact that they're not going to be training a muscle group or an exercise very often when they're hitting it with ultra high volume. And so they end up with pretty bad growth. And that's one reason a lot of drug-free guys struggle with things like legs, who are on body part splits. But again, it's important to remember, though, that DOMS is a totally separate thing from your normal recovery that you're thinking of. There's a lot of recovery that takes place in different tissues, and they matter for growth, they matter for training. But the DOMS itself, that soreness you're feeling, isn't actually in your muscle fibers. It's not in the part of the muscle fibers that actually grow. It's in a separate part of the muscle tissue. So try not to get them too confused. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.